thanks for coming. This is a pilot of our talk, first time we're giving it. There's a lot of information. So here we go. So my name is Gina Gianzero, and as Jane mentioned, immigration and issues related to supporting immigrants have always been in the forefront in the San Diego chapter of the League of Women Voters. Here we have a picture of our esteemed board of directors for this year. As you know, the League is a nonpartisan organization, so that means we don't support or oppose political candidates, but we do take stands on issues of importance, such as the immigration issue. So I'm going to begin by stating the obvious, and that is that we are, and always have been, a nation of immigrants. And the evidence of this is displayed here in several of these facts. And so while you read the slide, I just want to provide you a little bit of background information on the data that we're using for this presentation. So the data sources are from the years 2024 and 2025, 2024 and 2023, unless otherwise indicated. And they come from research organizations that rely upon government data sources. So that would be the United Nations or the US Census survey data. There is some variation in numbers across sources, across organizations. And additionally, since we will be using the term immigrants throughout the presentation, I wanted to clarify that we're going to be using the definition provided by the Census Bureau. And this broad definition includes all persons who were not US citizens at birth. So that includes naturalized citizens, legal permanent residents, green card holders, temporary people on temporary visas, students, workers, as well as undocumented immigrants. It also includes asylees and refugees. Okay, so the US has consistently relied upon immigrants as a source of both population and economic growth. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, the large presence of immigrants throughout our history, America's relationship with immigrants has often been contentious. So this slide is going to provide a simplistic visual overview of what I call America's immigration story. And the story begins with the push and pull forces that push people out of their countries and pull them to the United States. These include societal, economic, and political forces. The story then continues, I have too many things to hold here, continues with changing American attitudes towards the arriving immigrants. Different pockets of Americans, depending upon their geographic location, their economic social circumstances, their cultural background, experience immigration differently. And this produces variations in their attitudes towards immigrants. Which leads us to the next part of the story. These differing attitudes, in turn, fuel political division among Americans and ultimately the polarization of viewpoints among their representatives in Congress. So what happens there? The increasing polarization, not surprisingly, leads to congressional inertia. We have repeatedly seen divided Congresses fail to enact badly needed US immigration changes that leave in place a system that's severely outdated and ill-equipped to meet ever-changing immigration challenges. And the story ends with congressional inaction opening the door to the involvement of the executive branch, mostly in the form of executive actions. And once the president is involved, the judiciary is not far behind, adjudicating on the constitutionality or legality of those presidential actions. So let's delve a little bit deeper into specific aspects of the story. So we're going to start with the push and pull forces that bring distinct routes to our shores. So if we look at the purple line, it shows the total growth in numbers of immigrants to the US from less than 5 million in the mid-1800s to over 50 million today. The blue line represents immigrants as a percentage of the overall US population. So although immigrants have increased in numbers from 5 to 50 million, they currently constitute about 15% of the population, not much higher than the 14.9% of the population they constituted back in the 1800s. The green lines show the primary origins of various waves of immigrants. So we can see in the beginning that most of them came from Europe. They were pushed here by political persecution, religious persecution, and poverty. Simultaneously, they were pulled here by the promise of freedom and economic opportunity. In the late 1800s, you can see the line go up. The Industrial Revolution and access to land in the West fueled the largest waves of immigrants. And additionally, there were several congressional acts that actively encouraged immigrants from Europe and discouraged other groups, for example, Chinese. The enactment of the 1952 Immigration Act was the first time that we actually had a quota for Asian countries, so we began to see Chinese immigrants arrive. And then the act was revised in 1965, eliminating quota preferences for Europeans and increasing the overall number of immigrants allowed into the country and establishing a special admissions category for refugees. So ever since that time, immigrants have come largely from Latin America, followed by Asia. So although the number of immigrants has changed over time, their percentage of the population has remained fairly constant. What has also changed is where those immigrants come from and what they look like. So let's delve a bit into who is vested with the authority to make and implement the immigration policies that ultimately determine who gets in. The authority to make immigration policy lies primarily with Congress. Specifically, Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress, the legislative branch, the power to determine how immigrants become citizens and to negotiate commerce with foreign nations, which includes immigration. In addition to Article 1 of the Constitution, we also have the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which establishes birthright citizenship, meaning that anyone born in this country is automatically a US citizen. And finally, in accordance with its authority, Congress passed the primary legislation governing US immigration policy, to which I referred earlier, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. What's important to remember here is that the power that Congress has to control the borders is broad. And Congress has always had the right to determine who gets to come in and who gets to stay. The executive branch also plays a role, and for that we look to Article 2 of the Constitution. And there are several sections within Article 2 that give some authority to the president. He has the authority to conduct US foreign relations and national security, both of which are related to immigration. And he also has the take care clause, that the president is charged with taking care that the laws be faithfully executed. And it's this clause that's the primary source of the president's authority to enforce immigration laws. Here's something really important to think about. With respect to immigration policy, it's important to understand the concept of presidential discretion. Because although the president cannot ignore laws made by Congress, he does have discretion in deciding how the executive branch will interpret and enforce these laws. This discretion includes the power to decide whom to investigate, to whom to arrest, to whom to detain, and they also have the power to prioritize how they'll use resources. These are all things the executive branch is allowed to do. And the executive branch exercises its role in immigration primarily through two departments: the Department of Homeland Security, which includes ICE, among other agencies, and the Department of Justice, which includes the immigration courts, among other agencies. Now, so these agencies can decide if they want to prioritize deporting immigrants who have committed violent crimes or immigrants who have committed the nonviolent crime of crossing the border, or they may decide to do both. Okay, this is within their authority. Prior to taking office, candidate Trump stated that his intention to focus resources on deporting immigrants who had committed violent crimes. So let's move on to the third branch of government, which is the judiciary. And it plays a crucial role in immigration policy through district courts, circuit courts of appeal, and the Supreme Court. It's important to know that immigration courts are not part of the judicial branch. They are part of the Department of Justice, which sits within the executive branch. Specific aspects of the judiciary's role include judicial review, so that's the interpretation of immigration laws and regulations, checks and balances, so they can serve as a check on the decisions made by the executive branch, and finally, ensuring due process. So the courts determine whether immigration procedures comply with due process rights guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. The highest court, which makes final decisions, is the Supreme Court. So Supreme Court decisions in the past have reflected the understanding that Congress ultimately holds the power to enact immigration laws, while the president's power is restricted to enforcing those laws. That said, the Supreme Court has generally supported a strong role for the president in immigration policy, particularly with regard to national security and enforcement discretion. The Supreme Court has also, on occasion, demonstrated a willingness to intervene when executive actions fail to adhere to established legal procedures and infringe upon fundamental rights. Most of this talk to this point is all about everything prior to January 21st, 2025. Okay, so the next set of slides is going to focus on the priorities that have driven U.S. immigration policy up until the start of the current presidential administration. So historically, several key priorities have driven immigration policy. The need to fuel population growth, to support family reunification, to generate economic growth by meeting various employment needs, to promote diversity so that no one country dominates the immigration flow during a single year, and to provide humanitarian protections. So let's keep these in mind as we look at who gets in every year. So I know this is a busy chart here, but over on this side, we have the priorities I just discussed, right? Under the U.S. Immigration and Nationalization Act, immigration authorities are authorized to grant up to 675,000 permanent visas every year. And these visas are distributed in accordance with the priorities that I discussed. Family reunification has typically constituted the largest source of permanent visas. Nearly 500,000 of them are awarded annually. And although there's been no limit on the number of immediate family members of U.S. citizens who can come in any one year, there are limits on more distant family relatives of U.S. citizens, and there are limits on any relatives of non-U.S. citizens. So if you're a green card holder, you're going to be lower down in terms of priority to get your relatives into the country. With respect to economic and employment needs, there has been a cap of about 140,000 permanent visas allocated across specific skills. And to promote diversity, there's been a cap on the number of visas that can be issued to individuals from certain countries. And this quota system has actually created a significant backlog for the U.S. immigration system, because people from countries with high demand are often waiting up to 25 years to have the visas processed, whereas those coming from countries with low demand have unmet quotas. So we're actually not letting in the full 675,000. Finally, with respect to humanitarian protections, the U.S. has typically admitted refugees and asylum seekers. There's a ceiling on the number of refugees admitted annually, and it's set by the President in consultation with Congress. In fiscal year 2024, the Biden administration admitted about 100,000 refugees, the highest number of refugees admitted in a single year since 1994. We'll talk about how things have changed. Although there's no limit on the number of asylum seekers who may apply for and be granted admission each year, they must also meet certain criteria. And then finally, there are temporary visas for special humanitarian relief. Some of you have heard these, been in the news lately. Temporary protected status. There's also deferred action, which we know as DACA, humanitarian parole. And then other entrance opportunities are temporary, short-term worker, tourist, and student visas. So we'll discuss later in the presentation changes that the current administration has made specifically with regard to humanitarian protections and student visas. So let's just take a moment to look at who are today's immigrants. These data are from 2023 because it does take time to process data, so that's fairly current data. So the vast majority of immigrants are working age adults. There are nearly 23 million of them in the workforce. Nearly 40% of them work in management and professional fields. 35% of them hold a bachelor's degree, making immigrants key contributors to the economy as workers, consumers, and taxpayers. The vast majority of immigrants reside in the country legally, either as naturalized citizens or legal permanent residents or long-term non-immigrants. Unauthorized immigrants account for about a quarter of the immigrant population, and we'll focus on that group more closely a little bit later in the presentation. And finally, Mexicans comprise the largest single group of immigrants, followed by those from India and China. Despite the fact that so many immigrants come from Mexico, nearly 74% of them report being fluent in English. And just a little bit of background on them. Much of the immigration debate in America concerns the economic and societal impacts that immigrants have, both legal and illegal. Both legal and illegal immigrants have on the country. So the next few slides are going to illustrate this impact with some data. Exact numbers vary again across sources, but the sources are generally government sources, such as census survey data from 2023 and 2024. And as you can see, the economic impact is substantial in terms of immigrants' contributions as taxpayers and consumers, as well as their employment in such key sectors as STEM, agriculture, and construction. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that the surge in immigration between 2021 and 2026 would have a net positive effect on the federal budget and the economy. The societal impact of immigrants is reflected in the federal safety net programs to which they contribute. So this would be Social Security, this would be Medicare, while at the same time being restricted from accessing these benefits at the federal level. And a final important point of societal impact concerns the rate at which immigrants commit crimes, which, despite assertions of some, are much lower than those born in the US. The Trump administration has argued that immigrants are responsible for high levels of violent and drug-related crime in the United States, and it has further posited that this purported reason is justification for its policies of mass deportation. So I'm going to share a little bit about the relationship between immigrants and crime, but I want to preface that by making some clarifications about the data that is used, because quantifying crimes committed by immigrant status is challenging because those kinds of data are not normally kept by immigrant status. So we have limited data on this. And it's also important to note that there are other variables, such as the jurisdiction in which individuals may be accused of crime, disparities in the available resources to make arrests, to prosecute crimes, differences in prosecution policies. So these might all affect rates of arrests or incarceration. And I just think you should know that before looking at the data. But there are nevertheless a number of studies that undermine Trump's repeated assertion that immigrants represent a disproportionate source of violent crime. So, although the immigrant share of the US population has more than doubled between 1980 and 2022, the violent crime rate has fallen by 34.5%, and the property crime rate has fallen by 63%. As of 2023, incarceration rates across groups by immigration status show native-born Americans are incarcerated at the highest rates. And data on arrests for violent crime and drugs in Texas, and what's significant about Texas is it is one of the only states that has historically collected data by immigration status and crimes, and it reveals that immigrants of all legal status were arrested at lower rates than US-born citizens. Unauthorized immigrants in Texas had the lowest offending rates compared to both those of US-born and lawfully present immigrants. And finally, we've heard some claims about immigrants and terrorism. And I do want to point out that it's worth noting that since 9/11, the vetting of immigrants has been enhanced significantly, including more rigorous screening process, use of biometric technologies. So all of these things are making it less likely that we allow terrorists in through our immigration system. Finally, on the political realm, immigrants have an impact in the political arena, with nearly half of them being naturalized citizens with the right to vote. I will point out those with green cards do not have the right to vote. You have to be a fully naturalized US citizen in order to vote, but still, that's a significant percentage. So, much of the controversy around immigration centers on those who are undocumented, and both those who are already in the country, as well as those who are seeking to enter, to cross the border. The 1970s saw the greatest increase in the growth of undocumented immigrants, mainly drawn by economic opportunity. And although the pull of economic opportunity continues, there are other recent push factors. So human rights violations, violence, conflict, and natural disasters are all pushing people, creating an immigrant flow that is mixed with economic migrants as well as asylum seekers. Current estimates on the total undocumented immigrant population is over 11 million, although the numbers vary slightly across sources. Most come from Mexico and Central America and Asia, and they usually end up in the border states like California, Florida, and Texas. They enter both through illegal border crossings as well as by overstaying temporary student travel or work visas. And there have been some years where the data have shown that those overstaying work visas or temporary visas exceed those who have crossed the border without documentation. Most analysts agree that undocumented immigrants, despite some costs associated with increased demand for certain public services, are a net fiscal positive for the country over time. These positives include the essential worker jobs that they perform in key industries, the fact that they are entrepreneurs who are more likely to start businesses than native-born individuals, the significant economic contribution they make through nearly $300 billion in spending power as consumers and nearly $90 billion as taxpayers, while being largely ineligible for many social safety net programs. And finally, the undocumented immigrant community has deep roots in the US, with many of them calling themselves residents for over 5 years and living with and likely caring for US citizen children. So many of the disagreements about immigration revolve around perceived impact on 3 key issues: economics, national security, and cultural issues. So, but in many cases, as I just shown you, data don't support the arguments. And so I'm going to click through here some of the arguments for and against integration on the economic front. Again, some of the arguments for and against with respect to national security. And finally, for and against with respect to cultural issues. When it comes to cultural issues, we might ask ourselves whether Western European immigrants would be viewed in the same way as our neighbors from the South are currently viewed. Just food for thought. So, returning to that story that I showed you the outline in the beginning, political polarization around the perceived impact of immigration, right? Those issues that I just showed you, has crippled attempts by Congress to adapt the existing systems to meet changing needs, leaving us with a severely outdated system. The most recent policy changes in our immigration system occurred as far back as 1996. So what's happening now? So we have an immigration system whose laws have been referred to as complex as tax laws. The legal complexity is such that it is difficult for a lot of our representatives in Congress to understand deeply. Existing laws like visa caps, as I mentioned earlier, have created a situation in which we're processing applications from decades back. And so we're creating a system that we can no longer sustain. It's not meeting the needs that we had those priorities that we had originally used to determine who gets in. And the system's really overwhelmed by a lack of investment. So there's always been inadequate, but there's also been unbalanced investment. And that means we tend to invest more in agencies that enforce and deport rather than agencies that process and review. So they tend to favor ICE over processing agencies like the immigration courts. As a result, over 3 million asylum cases were pending before immigration courts at the end of 2023. And finally, without appropriate investments, I'm going to go back. Finally, without appropriate investments, we also run into situations where we have sanctuary cities that are overwhelmed by immigrant communities because we haven't done the planning and investing we need. The last point here is that this outdated system has actually incentivized the things that we don't want. The overblown asylum requests, the illegal border crossing, and the rise of sanctuary cities, because we don't have a system that has enabled us to meet these needs. The outdated system also opens the door to executive action, which is often piecemeal and ultimately involves the engagement of the judiciary. Many presidents, including Obama, Trump, Biden, proposed policies that led to lawsuits, effectively leaving the making of border policy in the hands of the judiciary. And where was it supposed to be? Congress. Okay, so let me go on to why isn't it wanting to advance to the next slide here? I'll make it, I'll force it. There you go. So, what's been happening since January 21st, 2025? Okay, we all know the significance of that date, the inauguration of the current administration. So, although executive action on immigration is not unique to Trump, what is unique about the Trump administration is the number and speed of actions and the volume of legal challenges to those actions. So Trump's executive actions, what I've done here is I've grouped them into 3 overarching priorities. And the first of these are actions that are effectively eliminating or restricting existing legal paths to entry. So you can see some of the things that we normally had. We had 100,000 refugees come in. Well, he's canceled refugees admissions, 0, right? Except for ones that were, very few that were already in process. Humanitarian protections, temporary status, shutting down of parole programs, revoking of student visas, travel bans, of course, limiting birthright citizenship. These are all existing legal pathways that are now becoming much more narrow. Another focus of the Trump administration's executive actions has been on increasing the authority of ICE. Actions like setting daily quotas, allowing deportation activities in sensitive areas like schools and churches, and deportation without due process. And a third, final focus of Trump's executive actions has been on expanding the engagement of entities in assisting with the identification and deportation of undocumented immigrants. So we've heard of efforts to penalize sanctuary cities because they won't cooperate with the administration, as well as using agencies like the IRS and other data sources to identify migrant status. Many of the Trump administration executive actions in all three areas of focus are currently being challenged in the federal courts. So as of September 2nd, there were 86 lawsuits just about actions on immigration. And I can bet you that number has gone up since September 1st. So the system is working to an extent in that things are where they need to be, which is in the courts, which is the most expedient manner of dealing with these executive actions in the face of an acquiescent Congress. So many actions are still being litigated, but they are actually already changing things on the ground. So bear with me on this one. The graph shows the numbers of immigrant encounters at the US-Mexico border. So just look at the top line, the golder line, and that represents changes in the number of encounters each month during the Biden administration. And it covers fiscal year 2024. And a fiscal year runs from October of 2023 to September of 2024. So we see peak encounters at over 300,000 was in December of 2023 in the Biden administration. But then we see a drop with increased Mexican enforcement. We see a second drop with the beginning of the secure border rule and the use of the CBP app. So we see those border crossings were declining during the Biden administration. If we jump to the second line, these first months here, October through January, are still Biden administration, where we see continued drops at the border. And then we see a sudden drop in February 2025. And this is in response to the deterrence activity of the Trump administration. So the limiting of humanitarian pathways for entry at the border, increasing enforcement by ICE, both at the borders and in the interior of the country. So analysts are expressing concern that Trump's emphasis on stepping up, on stopping migration through enforcement and deterrence, rather than through collaboration and negotiation, as was happening in the prior administration, in addition to the many lawsuits that are currently challenging these actions, may threaten the long-term viability of the administration's approach. So I'm not sure we can expect the numbers to continue to stay where they are. These analysts note that migration flows are often a result of many things beyond the US policy control. We already talked about them, the push and the pull and all these other things that are happening that are fueling migration that have very little to do with the US's deterrence approach. So the data on the following slides come from a group called the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse. We call it TRAC. This is a research and data gathering organization at Syracuse University. It relies heavily on data from federal agencies. TRAC strives for accuracy and compares data from various agencies for consistency, but it is dependent on the quality of data provided by these government sources. So I'm just going to put that out there. On the left-hand side, we see that there were over 60,000 people being held in detention centers as of August 24th, 2025. And for context, the total number in detention centers at this time in 2024 was about 36,000, indicating about a 70% increase. On the right-hand side, we see that about 72% of those held in detention centers as of August had no criminal convictions. So I want to be clear about this data point. It's not unique to the current administration. Most detainees are being held in immigration detention centers, not because they have been previously convicted of criminal offenses, but rather because they are awaiting administrative processing for removal or asylum. So people are shocked by this number. I wanted to provide some clarification. This is an important juncture in the presentation, though, for me to point out that there are U.S. laws on the books that establish that crossing the border illegally is indeed a federal offense, as well as assisting anyone who's attempting to cross the border illegally. All of these laws predate Trump, and it's therefore fair to conclude that anyone who is in the country without authorization has indeed committed a federal offense. The current administration has, however, predicated much of its mass deportation mandate on its assertion that immigrants are a primary source of violent crime in the U.S., and it has accordingly promised to remove these hardened criminals from the country. But illegal entry, although a federal offense, is not a violent crime. In fact, most undocumented persons are never tried in U.S. criminal courts for entering the country without authorization. That doesn't mean that they couldn't be if entities decided in their discretion to do so, but the vast majority are going to receive hearings through the Department of Justice's immigration courts. These courts differ significantly from criminal courts in their structure, procedures, and the rights afforded to individuals. And I do want to point out that seeking asylum has, of course, never been a crime of any sort. This slide provides a vivid illustration of what's been happening in these courts over time. On the left, we see a bar graph that shows that the backlog of cases awaiting hearings as of June 2025, over 3.4 million active cases were pending before immigration courts. And on the right, we see that the vast majority of this backlog, over 64% of cases, are people waiting for asylum hearings. Two conclusions. The backlog demonstrates that the current system simply isn't working, and the overall figure of 3.4 million cases is composed mostly of people pursuing their legal right to asylum. This slide makes 2 points. First, we see that there's been an increase in the number of deportation orders. As of June, judges have issued over 360,000 deportation orders. So for context again, this compares to 325,000 deportation orders in all of the previous fiscal year. Remember, this fiscal year is just ending now. That is an increase of 13,000 deportations per month. On the right-hand side, I'm going to make my final point. We see that the vast majority of those being deported were in cases decided without immigrants having legal representation. In fiscal 2025, the pie on the right, 80% of involuntary removals occurred in cases where individuals did not have access to legal representation. And this number was about the same under Biden. So why is this important? For two reasons. It sheds light on the meaning of due process, which does entitle immigrants to hearings, but it does not entitle them to free government-appointed counsel. It does not. So due process is different depending upon your status. Government officials are required to let the plaintiffs know with a list of here are some free services you can access, here are some pro bono services, but most individuals end up representing themselves, either because they can't navigate the system or there aren't enough affordable services out there. Secondly, according to the Congressional Research Service, the lack of legal defense does make a difference in hearing outcomes. Immigrants with legal representation studied over a 9-year period were over 10 times more likely to obtain favorable outcomes in their cases than those without legal representation. So just some food for thought around what's really happening there. So this is the point at which I pass the mic to Jane, and she'll talk about what's been happening most recently.
Thank you, Gina. Okay, a quick summary of recent developments over the summer. I'm sure all of you know about the passage of the Big Beautiful, so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which has $173 billion for ICE and detention. This is 4 times larger than past allocations, and it exceeds the spending for all other law enforcement across the country, passed the House 119 to 106. I'm sure you all know about the expanding ICE raids, but along with this, there has been some increased public opposition to these extensive deportations of non-criminals, as well as to the intense tactics of ICE. So, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, executive action often leads to court action in the form of lawsuits. And there are many, many lawsuits against the Trump administration's executive actions. Our goal today is to give you an overview of the legal responses to several of executive actions on a few key topics. I just want to remind you, I'm not an attorney, and so the discussion will be limited to a simple overview. For each topic, we'll have a brief summary of the executive action, a little bit on relevant cases, and then look at a balanced presentation of the government arguments and the plaintiffs, kind of in the spirit of pros and cons of the league. And then a little bit about the current status. So the first case concerns the Trump administration's plans to deport with expedited speed and process certain immigrants under the Alien Enemies Act. The executive office order of January 20th was entitled Protecting the American People Against Invasion. A later government proclamation declared that an invasion by the Tren de Aragua gang and justified the use of the Alien Enemies Act to promptly deport aliens. So here's a little summary of the arguments of both sides. On the government side, that the current conditions are an emergency and invasion, require quick action. There was a mandate for this. On the plaintiff's side, it's not a war, and this level of deportation is not necessary or constitutional. So one of the big cases was JGG versus Trump. And this is the case under the status section where the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 in April in support of due process for immigrants. There was a night, I believe it was April 19th, when the Supreme Court actually decided in the middle of the night that a plane could not leave Texas to go to Central America. For me, that was one of the strongest actions of the Supreme Court since Trump came into power. They all have agreed that due process is necessary, that it isn't just, one can just deport willy-nilly. Let me go back to my notes here. Although this was an important decision, they really have yet to rule on the actual merits of the use of the Alien Enemies Act itself. However, on just September 9th, an appeals court ruled against the use of the Alien Enemies Act itself, stating that there was no invasion. We could talk for a long time about all of these, but I'm going to hit a bunch of big ones. So the second case is about birthright citizenship, and this was the executive order revoking birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants and those with temporary visas. There are several cases, which we have stated up here. The government claims that it has no obligation to these children, while the plaintiffs argue that the order is unconstitutional because it violates the birthright citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment. On June 27th, the Supreme Court ruled on this case, but the rule was really about nationwide injunctions. It wasn't about, again, the merits of the case itself. It has yet to rule on those merits, and it's going to be interesting to watch, although one of the people who I listen to about the Supreme Court, Steve Vladek, has noted this week that there's very little action by the administration about these appeals, which suggests that maybe they don't think it's very likely to change. So we'll see. It's court watching has become part of my life this last few months. So a third focus of litigation concerns the tactics employed by ICE in conducting deportation raids, and this has been very much in the news just in recent weeks. The ACLU, who's been very active in these cases, filed a lawsuit in Southern California following the major ICE raids in Los Angeles in late June, and it claimed that the tactics of the raids were unconstitutional in the racial profiling, lack of reasonable suspicion, dungeon-like facilities, as well as lack of legal counsel. The government argued that its tactics are justified by an extreme crisis. So the racial profiling and other aspects of ICE raids were blocked by both a district judge in Southern California and also an appeals court. On August 8th, the government appealed this case to the Supreme Court, but unfortunately on September 8th, the Supreme Court ruled against the lower courts in an emergency ruling. And this is, the ruling, it's again very tricky because their ruling was that the raids could continue as they stood. It wasn't on the actual merits of the racial profiling. So it takes a while for these cases to wend their way through, but it's not over till it's over. So another very important topic is asylum. In January, Trump issued a proclamation suspending any entry at the border. This was challenged in a lawsuit in which the plaintiffs assert that both domestic law and international treaties establish the right to seek asylum and provide that the U.S. may not return people to countries where they're likely to face persecution or torture. Once again, the government claimed that a declared invasion was an adequate rationale for ending asylum. But a federal judge back in July declared that the proclamation was unlawful. The government immediately appealed this decision, and there is ongoing litigation about it. Okay, and then finally, sanctuary cities is the last litigation topic that we'll be covering today. There have been several executive orders regarding sanctuary cities, one stating, declaring the national emergency at the southern border. So it's a very complex topic, and it pits presidential powers as established in the Constitution and in federal immigration law against states' rights as guaranteed by Article 10 of the Constitution, which prevents commandeering by the federal government. So the arguments are laid out here. In the case of U.S. versus Illinois, a federal judge did dismiss the government's case based on anti-immigrant commandeering with some choice language in her opinion, that stating that anti-commandeering is a bulwark against abuse of government power, and that this would mark an end run on the 10th Amendment. So, ongoing. Okay, bipartisan policy proposals. Most analysts believe that the responsibility for reforming the country's broken immigration lies with Congress. But historically, the only immigration policies that have passed Congress have been bipartisan ones. So the imperative is to achieve some kind of bipartisan consensus moving forward. Okay, the Dignity Act is such a bipartisan proposal. This was first introduced but not passed in the previous Congress, and it was reintroduced in July 2025 by a Republican Congresswoman from Florida, Maria Salazar, and a Democratic Congresswoman from Texas, Veronica Escobar. And these were the same two women who had proposed it in the prior Congress. It currently has 21 initial co-sponsors, equally divided between the political parties. It includes 5 congressmen from California who are also co-sponsors, Republicans David Valadao and Kim Young, and Democrats Adam Gray, Salud Carvajal, and Mike Levin of the 49th District. Many of these are members of the Problem Solvers Caucus, by the way. So I'm going to say a little bit about the Dignity Act, but I must start by saying that the League has, and it's the National League who decides these things, not state or local. It has not endorsed any proposed legislation as of yet, but it is an example of bipartisan leadership that has coalesced around several areas of common ground. The need for greater border security, a path to legal status for some undocumented immigrants, reform of the asylum system, and efforts to reduce visa backlogs. So I'm not going to give you the full review of the bill, but just a few points. So this proposes a path to legal permanent status for long-time undocumented residents who have no criminal record and who've been here for at least 5 years. It doesn't provide citizenship, but it would provide a semi-permanent legal status called dignity status, which would be available after a 7-year wait period, during which a resident would be allowed to travel outside the country, work legally, and then it could be renewed every 7 years, potentially for the rest of their life. On the border, it does mandate the use of E-Verify, which I'm assuming most of you know what that is. On asylum, it looks for overwhelming evidence of eligibility for asylum and a credible fear interview within 15 days, which those in the know say would be quite challenging. And the visas, it would reduce backlogs and increase per-country caps. Now, there are other proposals, and I want to mention a different one, which is slightly more progressive than the Dignity Act. This is from the Center for American Progress. It put together a report that came out in July with recommendations that emphasize America's workforce needs and to expand legal immigration opportunities. It has many recommendations that are similar to those of the Dignity Act, but a significant difference is that it proposes a path to citizenship. So, I'm going to say a word about the League of Women Voters and Immigration. We have had a position on immigration since 2008 that was developed through the League process of consensus. It is generally in line with elements of the Dignity Act and the proposals by the Center for American Progress. But again, there's no formal position. But just a few of the points that stand out to me is that it supports a system that it supports legal status by meeting certain criteria, as well as opposition to deporting people with no history of major crime. And it also establishes certain criteria for legal admission, family reunification, kind of the usual criteria. And it does guarantee specific rights for all individuals, including immigrants, and in particular, fair treatment under the law and due process. So we're now to the what can you do section. And then we'll stop and have Q&A. So these are some things that many of our members are already doing locally. Help provide support to immigrant communities, give rides, deliver food, be a witness in immigration court through detention resistance. We do have a resource list, and you can pick up a sheet on your way out. There's also a QR code that will go to that same list, and it's on the paper, so you can get the active links. Okay, ICE raids. Now, some are braver than others, but if you witness an ICE raid, try to record it. There's something important about telling the truth about what is happening out there. Join others in efforts. There are groups that are trying to keep ICE away from hospitals, schools, and shelters. Support the ACLU and other groups in their litigation to limit ICE tactics such as mask use, racial profiling. I think you all probably know that just this weekend, California governor signed a bill to oppose mask use. And post on social media about the truth of ICE raids. So I'm going to list a number of local and national organizations that are important to be aware of. Certainly the ACLU in its litigation work. There are many organizations offering pro bono legal services. And these are two major immigration organizations nationally. LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, CHIRLA, which is the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles. And then these are some of our local agencies, organizations, Jewish Family Services, certainly, the San Diego Immigrant Rights Coalition, International Rescue Committee, Casa Cornelia, Catholic Charities, Al Otro Lado. I'm sure many of you are aware of these. So politically, you could be active too. The results may not come quickly, but momentum can build towards some kind of congressional action, one email at a time or one march at a time. So we recommend writing emails in support of bipartisan policy, attend town halls, be sure to ask tough questions, participate in marches, and make signs. We have an active Immigration and Deportation Committee, and I see Beryl has joined us here, which is great. And we're glad to have both members and non-members join it. We share information, we have speakers, we study specific topics. There also is a LWVUS Unite and Rise 8.5 campaign to engage voters on many issues leading up to the November election. So we have an important election year ahead. You can work on key campaigns, but remember to ask the candidates tough questions about their stance on immigration. And speaking out, of course, attending rallies, talking with families and friends, telling the truth, posting items on social media. So this is our last slide, and perhaps one of the most powerful steps we can take is to have tools to change the public narrative about immigration. So these are some of the myths that we hear all the time and some of the facts. And the League we also have a sheet over here of myths and facts. So one of the important facts is that non-citizens do not vote. There's extensive data on this. Immigrants are not criminals. They have lower rates of arrest and incarceration. immigrants perform essential jobs and contribute to the economy as taxpayers and consumers. And finally, that there really is no mandate for this mass deportation. The election was much closer than the current government makes it sound. So this is a QR code that goes to not just our resource list, but our whole immigration and deportation page on our website. Okay, we're at the Q&A, so let's hear what's on your mind. What role, if any, does the League have to expose or tell the truth about the inhumane tactics? I don't think we have any tricks on that. If you have any suggestions, I think I did, when I put out my president's letter for September, I did attach a video of an ICE raid because I felt that it was important that people see that. And I think, we all want to turn away from what's painful. But, that's why I post on social media the truth, because I think most people would prefer to look away. You want to take the next one? I can help you.
Please clarify, is it a criminal act or a federal offense to overstay a visa? And for this, I'm going to consult with our resident legal specialist, AKA my husband. He is a former U.S. federal prosecutor and has worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office. So if you don't mind giving that very legal answer question, please.
So,
Yes, you do for the.
by way of caveat, I am not an immigration attorney. I did spend the better part of 2 decades in the U.S. Attorney's Office. We dealt with a lot of immigration issues. The slide that you saw, 8 U.S.C. 1324 through 1327, I helped Gina put together. We did have a lot of interaction, and the truth is that within the Immigration Nationality Act is like the tax code. It is absolutely Byzantine. It is almost impossible to get through. It is in really, really desperate need of simplification, just like the tax code. Fact is that you are violating the law if you are here in an unauthorized capacity. Furthermore, if you assist somebody in remaining in the country illegally, the government could, in its discretion, go after you for harboring. And I use the expression illegal alien. I know that has become a loaded expression. Those are the terms that are used in the laws. So I know we are now using the vocabulary of undocumented person, but the laws speak of illegal aliens. They are, again, these are laws that were made a long time ago. But the sad fact is that if you are here in an unauthorized fashion, because you crossed other than a designated port of entry, because you stayed too long, whatever the reason, you are subject to federal criminal enforcement.
Thanks. This question is, do the majority of asylum requests get denied? I don't have the recent figures on this, but what is very interesting is that it varies a little bit by geography and by court. There is prosecutorial discretion about this. So it's, at the moment, I know it's over 50% get denied, but I don't want to be quoted the exact number. I believe that TRAC, the Syracuse, TRAC, has that, and if I get a chance, I'll look it up. But it does vary. It's easier to get asylum in San Francisco than in Georgia, for example. It's not surprising, but you know, there are these fuzzy areas in immigration law where discretion, you know, is a big factor.
It's my understanding that the majority are denied, but it would be an interesting statistic to put into your really wonderful presentation that this happens. And that also that the administration has recently cut the immigration judges, so that makes it even harder to come.
Well, and how compelling the fact that if you don't have legal representation, you're 10 times more likely to be denied. So what's really happening?
Well, also, the new administration has changed all the leadership at the Executive Office of Immigration Review, which oversees the immigration courts, and has fired quite a few immigration judges. So, you know, there's a complete takeover of that.
And then someone did ask once again on, in your statistics, who are you defining as immigrants? And we mentioned this in the beginning, but I'll reiterate it. So anyone who is not a U.S. born in the U.S. is an immigrant. So if you were not born here and you became naturalized, you're an immigrant. If you're a legal permanent resident, meaning you have a green card but you're not naturalized, you're an immigrant. Student visas, anyone on a temporary visa is an immigrant, asylees, refugees, and undocumented immigrants. We're using the Census Bureau definition. And of course, if we use data from 2023, then it's anybody who was here at that time that met any of those criteria.
Okay. So one question is, are you, the league, offering training for resistance efforts? No, we are not. But there is an organization called Detention Resistance, which does training for people, particularly around being a presence in immigration courts. And I know a number of us, Kathleen Grove over here, if you're interested in learning more, she has been down in the immigration court, she's done the training, and I think there are maybe a couple of others as well. And you did too, I think, yeah. So talk with them to get more information. And then the last one is data available, this is a good question, about the cost of keeping people in detention centers. I'm sure it's available, I'm sure we can find it, but I don't have it on the tips of my tongues. You know, versus how much immigrants could be contributing to the economy. It's all pretty.
For-profit facilities.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Paid per diem.
Yes. Yeah.
So now there's the potential of upstairs of the contracts to build these detention centers like the
Alligator.
Alligator, which is now being exposed.
So, prosecutorial discretion and resources are very, very closely tied. Throughout my couple decades in the federal government, there were sectors along the 2,657-mile border where specific Border Patrol sectors targeted all illegal immigration. It was called Zero Tolerance or Operation Streamline. And the idea there was anybody crossing the border illegally would be detained and prosecuted criminally. That is an impossible order to execute, even if there's a will, in places like San Diego. That is San Diego County. In smaller sectors like Del Rio, Texas, that would be possible. The problem is that when you do that, you are forcing bottlenecks at various points in the pipeline. So it's one thing to say, we're gonna hire however many you want, 300,000 additional ICE agents. Sure, line them up across the border and make as many apprehensions as you want, but then what happens? Okay, we build facilities. We have contract facilities, you know. Those cost a lot of money, and there's only so much bed space. But that's not the end of it. Who's transporting the detainees from Del Rio, Texas to Phoenix, Arizona? Where are the buses coming from? Where are the marshals who have to escort these coming from? Where are, as people have discussed, immigration judges coming from? My personal angst is that that's when civil rights become much more vulnerable. That's when you have masses of people in a courtroom or a jail cell, and their rights could be explained by an immigration judge or not. They could be understood or not. So that's my greatest anxiety about the process. I do think, in an optimistic sense, that the system is just going to have to correct itself, that there just aren't enough resources all along the pipeline. But for the moment, it does inform the prosecutorial discretion that Jane and Gina have spoken about. You'd like to think it's a scientific process, but whether you are detained or not, whether you are prosecuted criminally or not, is largely a function of good or bad luck. Exactly. Are there enough bed spaces to take you into a detention facility? Did you get caught at a port of entry, or did you get caught in the field? If you're at a port of entry where there's an immigration court perhaps available, maybe you get an expedited removal, where you just basically are sent back. It's recorded, but if you're unlucky enough to be in, in a more remote region, well, then maybe you're going to spend some time in a detention facility. So there's a haphazardness, there's an arbitrariness about this process that's also unsettling.
I'm going to do one last question. You've all been a great audience and patient. So this question relates to legislation proposals, and it says, could I give sponsors for other proposals that are before the legislature? Are there Senate versions? So the bipartisan legislation is just starting to be talked about. I'm sure that there will be a range of proposed bills. The Dignity Act has gotten a lot of press and seems to be gathering support, but there are likely to be others. There are things about the Dignity Act that are, not everybody wants or likes. But the one thing about this whole talk and process for me is that the arc of the story is gonna have to go through Congress at some point if we're gonna get out of this madness. So for me, it's important to be talking about proposals, to even suggest there could be bipartisan proposals. And I was pleased that the Dignity Act was mentioned in a LA Times article on Sunday. So get out and work for these elections and things like that, okay? All right, thank you all. And